Her name was Mrs. Moore, but to everyone in the neighborhood, she was just the lady who sat on the park bench every Tuesday morning. She was in her late 50s, with gray hair that she wore in a loose bun. Her clothes were always neat, though a little outdated. She looked like someone who had seen many years pass by, someone who had stories locked in her heart, but didn't always share them. People would smile at her, but she never really smiled back. At least, not at them. Every Tuesday, without fail, Mrs. Moore would carry a small box into the park. She would sit on the same bench right under the big oak tree and carefully open the box. Inside, there was always a single piece of cake. It was a slice of chocolate cake, thick with frosting and slightly crumbly around the edges. She would set it down on the bench beside her and look at it for a while, her hands folded in her lap. Then, without ever saying a word, she would sit quietly, staring out at the park, the piece of cake untouched. She did this every week, week after week. The other park-goers never asked her why. Some of them had noticed, some of them hadn't, but nobody ever thought much about it. Until one day, something changed. It was just like every other Tuesday when Mrs. Moore made her way to the park. But this day felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, and a sense of waiting. She sat down, took out the box, and placed the cake on the bench next to her, as she always did. But today, the cake seemed to take on a deeper meaning. It wasn't just a treat she left behind, it was a memory. A way to feel close to her daughter again. Her daughter Emma had loved chocolate cake. It was her favorite, and they would bake it together every week. After Emma passed away, Mrs. Moore kept this tradition alive, hoping that somehow, the act of leaving the cake behind would help her hold on to the love she had lost. But every week, the cake sat there, untouched by anyone. Mrs. Moore looked out at the park, wondering if anyone would ever take the cake, or if it would always be just another part of her silent mourning. But on this particular Tuesday, something was different. There was a young boy walking across the park, his eyes scanning the area, his footsteps slow and hesitant. He paused when he saw the cake. Let us know how this story impacted you. Like, comment, and subscribe to join us for more emotional journeys. It had been a year since Emma passed away. A whole year of silence, of grieving in private, of missing her daughter with every fiber of her being. She missed her laugh, her voice, the way Emma used to run around the house, always full of energy. She missed baking together, Emma stealing little bites of cake before it was even finished. Now, there was no laughter, no mess in the kitchen, just the quiet hum of the house. Every Tuesday, Mrs. Moore felt like she could hear Emma's voice again, as she prepared the cake. She imagined Emma's smile, her hands reaching out to grab the slice. It was a way to remember the good times, the memories that had become so precious after Emma was gone. Today, as she sat in the park, she couldn't help but wonder, would anyone ever take the cake? Would someone recognize the gesture for what it was? Would they understand what it meant? And then, as Mrs. Moore's mind drifted through her memories, a small voice interrupted her thoughts. The park was a familiar place for Mrs. Moore. It wasn't big, but it was peaceful. There was a small pond at one end, and a path that wound around it, with benches placed in the shade of tall trees. Children would often play near the swings, laughing and calling to each other. Older people walked their dogs, or sat and read newspapers, enjoying the quiet. It wasn't a place for big crowds, but it was a place where people passed by, day after day. It was in this little corner of the world that Mrs. Moore felt close to her daughter again. As she sat there that morning, the wind rustled the leaves, and for a moment she closed her eyes and let herself remember. She could see Emma sitting beside her, smiling, holding a piece of cake. She could hear her laughter, feel the warmth of her hand in hers. But then the sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Someone was walking toward the bench. It was a little boy, no older than 7 or 8. His hair was messy, and he had a backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused when he saw the cake on the bench. Mrs. Moore looked up, expecting him to just walk past, as most people did. But instead, he stopped, staring at the cake for a long moment. The boy stood there for a moment, looking at the cake. Mrs. Moore didn't move. She just watched him, waiting. He was small, with big brown eyes, and something about the way he looked at the cake made her heart twist. He looked hungry, not just for food, but for something else, something deeper. Mrs. Moore didn't know what it was, but she could see that he needed this moment, needed the piece of cake, just as much as she needed to leave it there. After a few seconds, he hesitated, then reached out slowly. "Is this for me?" he asked, his voice soft, unsure. Mrs. Moore nodded, her throat tight. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy looked at her with wide eyes, then at the cake again. Without a word, he sat down beside her on the bench and picked up the slice. He took a small bite, chewing slowly, his eyes closing as if savoring every moment. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Moore just watched him, the quiet understanding passing between them. There was something about this child, something that felt like a gift. Maybe it was the way he treated the cake with such care, or maybe it was the simple fact that he had taken it. But whatever it was, it helped her heal, in a way she didn't expect. As the boy finished the cake, he wiped his hands on his jeans and stood up, ready to leave. But before he walked away, he looked back at Mrs. Moore. The boy finished the cake and wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked up at Mrs. Moore and smiled, a shy smile that made her heart ache with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Thank you," he said softly. "You're welcome, Mrs. Moore replied, her voice thick with emotion. The boy stood up, ready to leave. But before he walked away, he turned back to her. "I like chocolate cake too," he said, as if that small detail meant everything. Mrs. Moore watched him walk away, a sense of peace settling over her. The pain wasn't gone, but in that moment, it felt like something inside her had been healed, just a little. It wasn't the cake that mattered, it wasn't the act of giving, it was the connection. The boy didn't know it, but in taking that piece of cake, he had shared a moment of healing with her. From that day on, Mrs. Moore found herself returning to the park every Tuesday, but with a new sense of hope. From that day on, Mrs. Moore found herself looking forward to her weekly ritual with a new sense of hope. She never knew who would take the cake, or when it would happen, but every Tuesday, she returned to the park, placed the cake on the bench, and waited. Sometimes, someone would come by and take it. Other times, it would sit there, untouched. But either way, she knew that something important had shifted. And sometimes, when she was lucky, a little voice would say, "I like chocolate cake too," and she would smile, knowing that her daughter's memory was still being shared in a way she hadn't expected. Grief is like a storm that comes and goes, but it never really leaves. It lingers in quiet places, in small gestures, in memories we can't let go of. And sometimes, the best way to heal is not through grand gestures or big moments, but through small acts of kindness, acts that let us connect with others in ways we never expected. Mrs. Moore learned that healing doesn't always happen in the way we think it will. Sometimes, it's the quiet moments, the ones we don't plan for, that make the biggest difference. Sometimes, it's the simple act of leaving a piece of cake on a bench, trusting that someone will take it, and in return, help us heal. Behind every piece of cake left on a bench, there's a story waiting to be shared. If this story reached your soul, help us spread the message. Like, comment and subscribe for more like this.